Ever since me and a lot of other creators have been talking about Citlali, people have been very confused on why she's held in such high regard, because of the fact that she doesn't look very appealing compared to other supports while reading off her merits. And as the #1 Citlali fan, I'm here to tackle that notion in this video. Hello there, Flip here, and today I'm going to be covering just why Granny Citlali is so strong, and a character to consider as she buffs multiple units while defining a whole new team archetype for pyro characters. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and to keep you updated. Shout out to all my lovely channel members, I appreciate your support, and with that, let's begin. If you want a more detailed look into how Citlali works, my video explaining her kit is something you should go look at first, but for the basic information of how she functions, she's an EM scaling cryo shielder. Being an Outling character, she's a scroll set holder obviously, which is just a free 40% damage bonus, and she's also able to decrease enemies' pyro and hydro resistances when melt or freeze is triggered. The thing to note about this res shred is that you don't have to trigger the corresponding reaction, so even if you're only able to trigger melt in your rotation, you will still decrease hydro resistances alongside pyro. Either of the reactions will reduce both resistances. Her shield comes from her elemental skill, but alongside that you will also have a summon that attacks enemies once every second, applying cryo 5 times over a 10-second window. And for her elemental burst, it's just a nuke. It does okay damage, even when she's built primarily with a shield. So on the surface, that is Citlali's kit. She can use the scroll set and reduce pyro and hydro resistances while having an okay shield. And if you look at her kit like that, then it doesn't really seem that spectacular. Like, yeah, she has a shield, but isn't really that strong in comparison to Zhongli or Layla. And from a buffing aspect, well, just compare it to Xiaolonen, who can also use the scroll set while shredding multiple different resistances and shredding them more than Citlali does. So what is our grandma here offering that is special? Well, it's actually the fact that she's cryo. I'm being so deadass, please don't click off the video. Granny Citlali being cryo and a decent applicator is something I never thought I would praise, but it allows us to resurrect a team archetype that gets less play than me, being forward melt teams. The reason why forward melt teams for pyro carries just didn't work is due to the fact that besides C6 Kaya, who's not very accessible, we simply just don't have cryo applicators fast enough to allow most pyro DPS to melt a decent chunk of their kits, to where it becomes worth using over vaporized teams. So the only way to enable consistent forward melts is through using double cryo most of the time. But again, that wasn't really worth it at all, because in comparison to the Hydra units like the 3 Jingchos, Kaya and Rosaria just aren't that good, as they do less personal damage and don't have as impactful buffs or upsides. And characters like Diana, who could offer impactful buffs like her C6, just didn't have the cryo application to sustain melt even when doubled up. So why would you ever run an Arlecchino double cryo team with Kaya and Rosaria, for example, compared to a VV Vape team, which was able to vaporize everything without stress while also giving res shreds and damage buffs? So in order for forward melt to be good, you would either need a cryo character able to sustain it by themselves, so you could pair them with Kazuha or Xiaolonen, or you would need a character that has to use double cryo, but provides enough benefits to offset those buffers, which Citlali just is. And according to my calculations, I can definitively just say that forward melt has become a lot of pyro damage to the best teams over vaporize. So if you care about taking your Arlecchino, Mavuika, Gaming, or Yoimiya to the next level, then you're going to want to listen to my Yap session. The first thing I want to talk about is double cryo, as that's the most interesting to me. The characters this works best for are Arlecchino and Yoimiya, as with Kaya or Rosaria alongside Citlali, you should be able to melt all their hits that apply pyro pretty consistently. So who should you use, Kaya or Rosaria? I wish I could just say use none of them because they both have their issues. Rosaria does offer more offensively than Kaya and is better theoretically, as she gives you crit rate buffs, but the biggest issue with her is that she's stationary, so if enemies move out of the circle, that could cause some melt inconsistency. And with Kaya, he offers literally 0 buffs, but you can move around with him. That's his benefit. Overall, I'm more inclined to recommend Rosaria, as the crit rate buffs do go a long way, and can also help you get away with a not so amazing build, but it doesn't matter that much in practice who you decide to use. And for Citlali's gearing, besides her signature, which is obviously her best weapon, her best 4-star weapon is Wandering Evan Star, which is what most of what I looked at assume she has. And then your next best options are Favonius or Sac Frags. An important thing to know about Sac Frags is that you don't want to use the skill twice and then burst, as Citlali already has very sensitive rotations, and some of them involve spending time in Bennett's circle, which can hinder your buff uptime, which obviously isn't worth it. And as I said before, even when building for her shield, her burst still does a decent amount of damage, so you don't just just want to not use it. So even if you do have Sacrificial, I'd recommend building your energy around one skill cast, which with this scroll set is anywhere from 160 to 180 energy. Now let's actually take a look at the characters, shall we? The first character I looked at was Arlecchino, which compared to our current best team in my opinion being Vape with Shilonen, Citlali double Cryo kind of just shits on the team. It literally just does more damage overall. It's more front-loaded because melts will scale higher than Vapes, and on top of this you can play shorter rotations. Yelan keeps Arlecchino gated at 18-second rotations due to her burst cooldown, where the longest skill cooldown on the double Cryo team is Citlali herself, who's gated by 16 seconds. So you can even cycle through damaging windows much quicker. And to top things off, Cryo Resonance will almost always be active on this team for a free 15 crit rate, and Rosaria will also share some, so you can focus some of your crit rate towards more offensive stats. And both Cryo units are able to output enough damage to match Yelan's, so you don't lose the off-field impact of the team either. The only thing you need to really worry about is keeping enemies within Rosaria's circle, but as long as you can do that, this is pretty comfortably Arlecchino's best team currently. Similarly, this should also be Yoimiya's best team, at least when looking to maximize her personal damage, though it may not be as practical compared to Arlecchino, as Yoimiya will back away from enemies, which can cause them to chase you outside of Rosaria's circle. I actually went ahead to look at 4 Yoimiya teams. To be honest, I don't know a lot about Yoimiya theory crafting, but I'd assume the best way to maximize her damage output is to be played on Vape setups, in which the best is going to be with Shilonen, or if you have to use a shielder then Zhongli, Bennett and Yelan. And safe to say that double Cryo teams just outperform her Shilonen teams, while still providing a shield, making a lot more practical, as well as being massively ahead of her shielded teams. The last Yoimiya team I looked at is Vape Melt, but I'll talk about that whole archetype more later. But all this to say that Yoimiya gets a pretty sizable buff from Citlali. In my opinion, both her and Arlecchino are the characters that benefit the most from double Cryo teams. Outside of that, carries like Hu Tao simply just apply Pyro too fast for double Cryo to be viable, and for the other slow Pyro applicators, instead of running double Cryo, you can actually get more mileage out of Citlali by using her as a solo Cryo applicator. The two characters that benefit the most from solo Cryo teams are going to be Mavuika and Gaming. Gaming can be a stand-in for any Pyro Plunge DPS like Diluc, so there would be no issues with using him instead of Gaming, but at C6 he is just the best, so I'm going to be using him as the example for Plunge DPS. Now going back to Mavuika, her best DPS teams currently is going to be with Bennett, of course, he's inescapable, and then you can utilize Shilonen and Citlali. Because both of them are Natlin characters, you can't just run the scroll set on both of them, as that just doesn't work. So either Shilonen or Citlali will have to use a different set. You can use artifact sets like Petra, Instructors, or Tenacity on Citlali, but optimally you want to keep her on the scroll set to keep her energy requirements low, as her burst is more important than Shilonen's, and then you can give the Ocelot, Petra, or Instructors. I am more inclined to recommend Instructors, as the low uptime matters less, as Mavuika on this team only melts her first few hits. The funny thing about Mavuika melt teams is that Citlali isn't actually enough to allow her to melt everything. You are only able to melt Mavuika's burst and then her first 2 charge attacks. But the reason why this still ends up being Mavuika's best team even over her Vaporize variants is due to the fact that her burst is like 60% of her damage, and Citlali is able to amplify this hit the most through her buffs, which just puts this ahead of her other teams by a decent margin. And not only is this the best DPS Mavuika team currently, I haven't looked at any of the new Muolani stuff, but this is also looking to be the highest damaging team in the game. Power creep. Moving on, we have Gaming and by extension most other plunge carries. Yeah, she's kinda just better than using Furina even if you're getting less plunges. She just amplifies damage a lot more than Furina does, enough to offset her personal damage and increase plunge frequency. And I assume this trend would stay the same when looking at other plunge carries like Diluc or anyone you'd want to pair C6 Bennett with. Just keep in mind you can't spam plunges as recklessly as you can with Furina, so just wait in the air until you see Cryo has been reapplied and then plunge. Also, if a Pyro Aura is established ever, there is zero hope in getting it back. Citlali does also take less of a burden for you to have to learn Shanya and VV combos, as resistant shreds don't stack that amazingly, so you can much easier just have her on Song of Days Past. So yeah, there are even viable forward melt teams where Citlali is the sole enabler, and is both Mavuika and any plunge DPS you want to play's best setup. And even though you aren't able to melt as much as you can Vape, melt being a stronger reaction at a base on top of Citlali being a Cryo character that actually does something, makes the trade-off worth it in the cases I mentioned prior. The last team I want to talk about is going to be Vape melt teams, which as you would expect by the name is being able to both melt and vaporize your damage. As I've already stated multiple times, Citlali just doesn't apply enough pyro to sustain melts by herself. However, if you pair her with a Hydra unit like Yelan or Jingqiu, against freezable enemies your Hydra application won't be hindered, allowing you to vape everything you would normally. But now additionally you also get some melts when Citlali does apply Cryo, which should be adding like 5 or so melts. Every pyro DPS besides like Klee should be able to use this effectively, even Hu Tao. And a friend of mine, thank you Tracer, showed me a very consistent rotation that allows you to easily get a Pyro Scroll buff on the team, while still being able to melt Citlali's burst for her damage. Because she applies Cryo consistently as well, you will also react with Hydra from all field to be able to buff Yolan's damage as well. The only character I looked at this team for is Yoimiya, in which it's better than her Xilonen variant, because Citlali does decent damage which Xilonen doesn't, and you basically get the same buffs while adding in melts. This line of logic should apply to every other Pyro damage dealer that can use this archetype. It will technically outperform the Xilonen variants because of the melts you can get. The only issue with this is the fact that Vape melt doesn't work that effectively against bosses, as they can't be frozen, and because of that, when Cryo is applied onto your Hydro aura, you will lose it, causing you to potentially lose Vapes. And this isn't to say that you won't be able to clear against bosses or anything, just the fact that if I were to calculate how good it is on paper, it just wouldn't be anywhere close to the actual performance of the team. There are solutions people have told me to using Citlali on Vape melt against bosses. The first is to not use her burst at all, and therefore you can stay below the point cap for a majority of the rotation, and not activate her summon, in which, sure, but then at that point you really are just using an inferior team to Xilonen, as you will buff less and don't get any of the melts, so it'll be about as good as just slapping on Zhongli. And then the other solution would just be using double Hydra teams, as you'd get so much Hydra application that outpaces the amount of Cryo Citlali can apply. But again, this doesn't solve the solution of you getting any melts. So against any bosses, these Vape melt teams simply aren't that fascinating. But to be fair, most Abyss lineups are mixed, or can have a very tanky single enemy that aren't bosses, so it's not like the team is completely useless if it can't face bosses as well. I just want you guys to keep in mind that the performance of this team will be worse if you are against a boss. You can go ahead and play your Vape Mel 2 Taos, Linnies, Arlecchinos, and so on. It is an upgrade over using Xilonen assuming the enemy is freezable, and just okay if not. All in all, even only looking at the Pyro roster, we can see how much of a ceiling raiser Citlali is for the meta, and this isn't even all of her use cases, as I'll delve more into her other great teams with Kinich, Chaska, Muulani, and so on next week. But with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts, as I'd love to hear it and respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, I love you and appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.